in African American communities.
Yes, sir. That is true. So what do you want, chocolate or nuts?
Nuts.
That's what she said.
I'm not sure about that.
What's your answer?
Growing up in Philadelphia, a big city, there are a great number of homes that heated by coal,
Yes,
and they're relatively new homes.
yes.
In fact, there was the story I remember my father talking about. They were still, that was back in the 40s. Of course, you couldn't buy new vehicles and so forth. It was difficult, you know, war effort and all. They were hauling ashes by horse and wagon from North Philadelphia down to the southern end, where the Naval Hospital was, the big stadium, the airport was, and they were all, those ashes are what the foundation of that was. So coal fire burners were distributed all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't see in that instance, and that under those circumstances, I don't see any racial ties to it.
Well, sure, if everybody's affected the same, there's no component in any direction.
We ourselves had an oil burner at the time. We heated by oil. And that row of 30 houses, some were coal, some were oil. And, yeah, you know.
I think he's talking about the factory, the whole factory itself, not just the use of the product.
All right, what you're implying is industrial areas,
Yeah,
and that is true.
yeah, I think that must be it.
But is that because of coal or because it's an industrial area? And homes surrounded by factories are not as pricey as homes in the suburbs.
Well, that's why I talked about the isolation of the variable. You know, because it is sort of the immediate reaction to say it's poverty, and due to decades of discrimination, people of color are more likely to be in poverty, therefore people of color are more likely to be near the factories. But that's why they isolated the variable. Thank you, sir. What button do I press?
I think you just hit the next arrow to go to the next one, and then I'm not sure, just tell me when you get to the slide that the video's on and I'll try.
Gotcha, thank you.
But under the same, you know, living same general neighborhood, there was a spot which was called Lamont, named after Lucretia Mott. And it was a Negro neighborhood, but in the suburbs.
Mm-hmm.
And right next to very nice homes. And there were some very nice homes in there.
Let's talk about Flint, Michigan. Is that a good example of environmental racism?
Yes.
How about Katrina? It's a very real problem. And it's great to have, you know, feelings the otherwise, but that's why we have experimentation. That's why we isolate variables. That's why we do complicated mathematical algorithms to separate.
Pensacola. You heard about Pensacola?
What about Pensacola?
There's a black neighborhood over there in Pensacola surrounded by several toxic waste dump areas, and the neighborhood has history in their family of cancers from, you know, grandpa, grandma, all the way up to the children. The playground is right next to a toxic waste dump. And Dr. Gloria Horney, a friend of mine, has recently had that place shut down, and the owner of the place, I think it's called Rolling Oaks, recently had it shut down, and the owner of the place, I can't remember his name, is somehow related to Senator Greg Evers.
It's a neighborhood that she shut down, the whole
No,
neighborhood?
the toxic waste dump that surrounded the
But
neighborhood.
that's not going to solve the problem.
No, it's not. It's not, but there's sulfuric dioxide that's being released from there. And she was able to have monitors established around there to notify the residents when the carbon or the sulfur dioxide levels would rise up. But their community is destroyed and so are their lives.
They have nowhere to go.
Now, it's not just a U.S. problem. While low-income communities contribute less pollution than the affluent, they are likely to incur greater environmental exclusion. With fewer transportation links, access to fresh produce, greater atmospheric pollution from motor vehicles, boo-boos, and toxic waste. Now, as a human rights lawyer, I'm not always sleeping in dirt. Sometimes I'm drinking champagne at the Ritz in London. And I just thought that was a nice juxtaposition to talking about the Lulus.
Well, it'd be interesting to see what it took to have you be there.
Oh,
What did it cost the environment for you?
How big is your footprint?
Yep.
I walked across the ocean.
Yeah.
Oh, did you walk here from?
Oh, no, I have a big footprint.
I took a helicopter, an aerosol can. The civil right of survival, the Urus tribe, took a hell of a carbon footprint to get here, I'll tell you that much. The Urus people who moved to floating islands of reeds that they fashioned themselves to escape warring tribes such as the Inca, actually it wasn't such tribes, it was the Inca they were running away from, have turned to solar power as a means to continue their ancient way of life. While the rush towards solar has increased globally in the last 5 years, the villagers of Lake Titicaca have relied on solar power for almost all of their energy needs for the past 30 years. This makes sense, of course, as the islands are extremely flammable, so use of diesel or coal has never been a viable option. It's kind of incredible. When I was there on the floating islands, they have ashtrays everywhere. Of all the great situations for a non-smoking ad, you know?
Well, the reason they have ashtrays is to keep people from burning down the island by dropping their cigarettes somewhere.
Didn't stop me. The race to solar as a race for survival. In addition to those obvious benefits for the inhabitants of the world's highest navigable body of water, not the word water, there's a more dire reason for their appreciation of alternative energy. In 2009, Lake Titicaca was at its lowest point since 1949 due to evaporation caused by global warming. If temperatures rise more than 2 degrees Celsius, then as much as 85% of the lake will disappear. 2.6 million people depend on the lake for sustenance through fishing and irrigation. When I was there, because it's very primitive, you know, you go into somebody's kitchen, they cook you some soup, it's like from the Stone Age. And then you walk out and you see even they're too smart to have Comcast. All right, let's see if this one will work. I climbed to the top of the highest point on Isla Tequila, which was quite a journey. And you'll potentially just have to imagine whatever. Okay. So what Peru is doing in the global fight against climate change. The Peruvian government has purchased 500,000 additional solar panels to be donated to Peru's rural areas. In addition to leaving a nominal carbon imprint, the strategy is expected to increase electricity availability to 95% of rural Peru. It has issued protocols and a plan for climate change that drastically reduces transport emissions, which is the leading sector for emissions in Latin America. To combat the impact of climate change, the indigenous women of LL.M in Peru have turned to ancestral farming techniques with support from UN Women's Fund for Gender Equality. In addition to healthier crops and improved incomes for the community, the program has boosted indigenous women's participation in public spaces and decision-making. Who says the UN doesn't do anything? Well, Donald Trump. Environmental sustainability and justice as a political right. In this subsection, we are going to examine two topics relating environmental sustainability, justice to political rights, due process implications in the uneven enforcement of environmental laws, and a lack of equal opportunity to receive resources. In this picture, it's in downtown Lima, and the police are getting ready for a protest. That's at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. For some reason, it just fit as industrialism. The EPA offers unequal protection and enforcement of environmental laws and regulations. And how do we know this? Although the EPA has a civil rights division to investigate developers and officials who knowingly create disproportionate environmental hazard, there has never been one charge filed in its history. If I get this thing to play, you can see 30 seconds of protests happening, and I'm videoing it behind bars because you're never supposed to be in a protest. The Peru petroleum protests. Essentially, this is a small snippet from a documentary that explains that the pipes keep leaking into the water. The fish are drinking the water. They catch the fish. This is in the Amazon region of Peru. They eat the fish, and they get poisoned, and their children who eat the fish die. So if you were to, YouTube protests in Peru, or later I can show you on my videos, you'll see people carrying coffins in the street. That would be held by a family who lost a child.
When was that? When was that going on?
2014, but it's actually still happening today.
Well, talk about the racism issue. What about the Dakota Access Pipeline? That's a perfect example.
That's really beyond my area. Remember, I'm not an environmental scientist, I'm a human rights lawyer.
But this is human rights. I mean, those are
Right.
Native Americans who are having it. It went around the white population, which is where it was supposed to go, and they rerouted it to go through the Native American area. It's a perfect example of this racism issue you're talking about.
Well, and so actually this, the oil pipelines here are being built through the indigenous populations. They're the ones being disproportionately affected in Peru, and also in large swaths of Africa where they're doing it. So it is not just something that happens in the United States. It's a fairly universal thing of putting things where the people are defenseless and oppressed. You can't do anything about it, except have their children die. That brings us right to this slide. Environmental sustainability is both a civil and political right. Like ethnic minorities and low-income residents in the West, indigenous peoples also live in areas more likely to be harvested for resources that burden their lands, health, and livelihoods than their non-indigenous counterparts. As a political right, indigenous and rural peoples are also likely to have little or no access to the resources that are harvested from their lands. In Arequipa, the next slide, both indigenous and rural protesters blocked traffic to express rage that they are charged more for gas and other natural resources than the people of Arequipa and Cusco. You know where Cusco is? It's where Machu Picchu is. Despite being the provider of those very resources. Actually, Cusco is a 4-day hike or a 2-hour train ride to Machu Picchu. I hiked 4 days. If you ever have the chance, take the train. Now, remember earlier I said I was behind the bars? I got a little stupid. I decided to go out in the streets. These are the protesters lining up, and as the clip would play, they go out. This is a colleague of mine from the UK, and he actually got trampled. But I was there video recording it instead of helping him, so, you know. Environmental sustainability justice as an economic right. In this subsection, we will examine environmental sustainability as economic rights in the context of the right to have a livelihood. Okay. Oh, that's London Tower where they keep the crown jewels, like, you know, economics. All right. It was 5 in the morning. You're lucky I'm not on the floor. Give you some examples of economic rights.
We have a debate going on right now about increasing the tax on imported solar panels.
Okay, but I mean,
To protect American industry.
sure, but I mean more fundamentally, what are economic rights?
Right to have a job.
Yes,
Right to work, yeah.
right to work. How about property rights? Your right to buy and sell property.
Intellectual property?
Intellectual property, sure. How about labor rights? That's where you get your right to livelihood. Here's one you might not guess. A right to a free primary education. That is a property right. That's how it's classified by the Supreme Court. That's why the Constitution protects your right to a K-12 education for free in the United States. And the whole world has adopted that, actually, at least as far as primary school. It's actually in the Declaration of Human Rights. Sorry, I'm blanking.
What was it? It was in the paper this morning about education on civil, a topic of instruction of civil rights. It is a state law in Florida, but evidently it is not predominant throughout all other states.
When was it put in the Constitution of the United States that our students had a right to a free K-12 education?
And its inception.
No, it was not, because I teach that.
Uh-huh.
We didn't even have high schools until, most places didn't have high schools till the 1900s.
I don't remember the exact decision.
But it wasn't in the Constitution, was it?
No.
No,
It's
it
a
absolutely,
judicial decision.
it was a judicial decision, but it is the judiciary's job to interpret the Constitution. And it actually might have been in something like the 1940s or 50s.
Yeah, that's what
Property rights, such as alienability of private property, also includes the right to access free primary education.
How did that become a
Sorry?
property right? How did that become a property right? Why did they define that as an education is not a house?
economic, yes, the right to education is.
I thought you said education, a right to.
Education is classified by the Supreme Court as a property right.
Is it the diploma that's the property?
No. No, presumably it's the right to be able to make your own way in the world of self-determination. let's
So
be
it's
honest,
like a
I didn't
intangible
even,
property.
I didn't even go over the case in law school. I learned about it in middle school. So it's a far reach back. Labor rights, such as the right to form trade unions, the right to seek an occupation of one's free choice, and the right to decent living earned from labor. And this is another one people don't really think of, health rights, such as the right to receive emergency medical treatment. Fisheries and the tragedy of the commons. Who brought up fisheries earlier? Okay. So I can't play this for you. Who here knows what the tragedy of the commons is? Okay, who wants to say it? Who wants to say it out loud? George?
The tragedy of the commons is that if you have a commonly shared resource, like a field for your sheep was the example I remember, and everybody has some sheep in the common field, the person who has the most sheep gets the most benefit, and eventually you end up having so many sheep in your commonly shared field that the quality of the field begins to degrade and less sheep can survive on it. And so you end up destroying the very resource that you were commonly sharing and relying on for your survival.
Excellent. Now I'm going to make it more complicated by referring to it as present interest and a future interest. The present economic interest of fisheries in three economies. Because obviously the issue that was going to be tackled in the last slide was overfishing, leading to there not being enough fish. Fishermen are going home empty-handed. This is an Essaouira, Morocco. That's the main port for fisheries. It's the largest fishing market in Africa. It's 56% of their agricultural exports and 16% of their total exports. It's 3% of the gross domestic product in Morocco. And it's 400,000 jobs in Morocco. Apalachicola, Florida. Ever heard about the oyster problem in Apalachicola, Florida? Still damn good oysters. The U.S. has the largest exclusive economic zone in the world. Shellfish, oysters, clams, mussels account for 2/3 of marine aquaculture production. It is 1.1% of our GDP. I couldn't find that anywhere. I actually had to do math and take out a calculator for about 20 minutes. It's 1,600,000 jobs. This is Padabang, Bali. You ever have the chance to spend a night there? The ferry runs 24 hours. Move on. 95% of fishery production is from subsistence fishermen. That's 3% of Indonesia's GDP. That's 6,400,000 jobs. So what happens if you tell 6,400,000 people, or at least 95% of them, if they don't fish, they don't eat?